At dawn on March 7, 1945, the mist hung thick over the Irrawaddy Valley, swallowing the rumble of distant engines and the faint hum of mosquitoes. In the jungle's dripping silence, figures moved like shadows, barefoot men in tattered uniforms, their rifles wrapped in oilcloth, their faces streaked with mud and defiance. They were not supposed to be here. Orders from Calcutta said to wait. Reinforcements weren't ready. Air cover was patchy, but their commander, a quiet, sharp-eyed Burmese guerrilla named Aung Thin, had decided otherwise. Before headquarters could even decode his last radio message, he was already deep behind Japanese lines, preparing to do what no one expected: liberate Burma on his own terms. SOE Field Report, March 1945. The war in Southeast Asia had dragged on for 3 long, blood-soaked years. Since 1942, Japan had occupied Burma, cutting the vital supply line to China, the Burma Road, and turning the region into a living nightmare of disease, forced labor, and scorched villages. The British Empire, humiliated by the rapid collapse of its colonial forces, had retreated in chaos across the Chindwin River, vowing to return. But the return came slowly. Monsoon after monsoon buried their hopes in mud. The jungles devoured men, machines, and morale alike. U.S. Army Southeast Asia Command Memo, 1944. By 1945, the Allied command had reorganized under General William Slim's 14th Army, one of the most disciplined and inventive forces of the war. Slim's doctrine was pragmatic: win hearts, feed troops, stay mobile, and hit hard. His men, British, Indian, African, Chinese, and Burmese alike, were hardened by failure. But even Slim's cautious optimism stopped short of what Aung Thin proposed. Official plans called for a coordinated assault from the northwest in late April, supported by heavy artillery and RAF bombers. Yet Thin's scouts had returned with intelligence that changed everything. The Japanese garrison at Prome, a key communications hub, was crumbling from within. Food shortages, disease, and desertions had hollowed its defenses. Waiting for Allied bureaucracy to catch up meant losing the moment. 14th Army Intel Summary, February 1945, in the dense teak forests of the Pegu-Yoma Hills. Thin's unit, a mixed band of Karen, Kachin, and Burman partisans, gathered around a flickering kerosene lamp. The guerrilla leader spread out a hand-drawn map over a crate of rice sacks, his finger tracing supply routes and Japanese patrol zones. "If we move now," he whispered, "we take Prome before sunrise. If we wait, we die waiting." His lieutenants exchanged glances. They had no tanks, no air support, and barely enough ammunition for a 2-hour fight. But they had something the Japanese no longer did: momentum. SOE Liaison Diary, March 1945. Thin was no ordinary partisan. Born in Rangoon in 1911, he had once studied engineering before the British colonial police arrested his brother during a student protest. That moment turned him from scholar to soldier. When Japan invaded, promising Asia for Asians, Thin initially saw liberation in their words. But after witnessing Japanese troops burn his home village and execute farmers as spies, his faith turned to fury. He slipped into the jungle, joined the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, and later coordinated with Force 136, Britain's clandestine special operations executive branch in Southeast Asia. Trained in sabotage, demolitions, and coded communications, he became the invisible hand guiding uprisings that tied down entire Japanese divisions. SOE Training File Number 21/Burma. By early 1945, British officers admired but feared his independence. His coded transmissions were precise yet infrequent, his movements unpredictable. Some in Calcutta called him the Burmese Lawrence. Others, more cynically, called him a rebel in Allied uniform. But the results spoke louder than doctrine. In January, his forces had ambushed a Japanese supply column on the Sittang River, capturing over 40 rifles, 6 light machine guns, and crates of rice. The attack, executed with surgical timing, disrupted logistics for weeks. It also emboldened nearby villages to rise up, creating a chain reaction of revolt that the Japanese could not contain. British Eastern Command Report, January 1945. Now, in early March, Thin scouts reported that Japanese officers in Prome were preparing to withdraw toward Rangoon. The retreat would strengthen the enemy's last bastion along the coast. If Prome fell, however, the entire defensive line could collapse. Yet HQ's radio orders were explicit: hold position. Await coordinated offensive. Thin read the message in silence, then folded it into his pocket. He had seen too many opportunities lost to hesitation. If victory is delayed, he told his men that night, freedom waits in chains. Intercepted message, Calcutta Relay Station, March 1945. The assault began under a moonless sky. Thin divided his 600 guerrillas into 3 columns: north, west, and south. The northern group cut the telephone wires leading to Rangoon. The western flank blocked the Irrawaddy crossing with mines scavenged from abandoned British stockpiles. Thin himself led the southern push, wading waist-deep through swamp water as fireflies glimmered like tracer rounds in the mist. At exactly 4:10 hours, his signalman tapped out the code word, "Tiger awake." Mortars erupted across Prome's outskirts. Within minutes, the town's silence shattered under gunfire and shouting. Field Operation Log, Prome Sector, March 7, 1945. Japanese sentries, startled from sleep, fired blindly into the trees. Thin's men moved fast, using captured Arasaka rifles and grenades smuggled by Force 136 drops. A supply truck exploded, lighting up the jungle in orange flashes. By dawn, the railway station was in flames. Thin stood on the platform amid the chaos, directing fire with calm precision. When a bullet grazed his shoulder, he wrapped it with a strip of his own tunic and kept shouting orders. Witnesses later said he fought, as if time itself had stopped waiting for permission. British Liaison Debrief, April 1945. By mid-morning, Prome was theirs. Smoke coiled above shattered buildings, and a tattered Union Jack, improvised from a bedsheet, rose over the station tower. The news raced through the jungle faster than any radio could carry it. Villages erupted in celebration. Farmers offered food and shelter to exhausted fighters. Even the Allied air patrols flying overhead were confused. According to their maps, Prome wasn't supposed to fall for another month. RAF Combat Log, Burma Sector, March 1945, but the victory came at a cost. Thin's unit had lost nearly 90 men, and ammunition was critically low. Worse, the Japanese 33rd Division was already mobilizing from the south. He knew retaliation would be swift, merciless, and overwhelming. Still, as his men reloaded and tended to the wounded, Thin gazed toward the horizon where the smoke cleared over the river. Somewhere beyond that haze lay the road to Rangoon, and perhaps the soul of a free Burma. He turned to his second-in-command and said quietly, "We started this without permission. We'll finish it without asking." SW Field Summary, March 1945. The radio crackled hours later. Allied HQ demanded an explanation. Unauthorized advance jeopardizing strategic timeline, the message warned. But by then, the facts were already on the ground. Prome had fallen. Burma's resistance had tasted victory, and the Japanese command, stunned and disoriented, now scrambled to understand how a band of barefoot guerrillas had outmaneuvered them without air cover, armor, or sanction from above. Imperial Army Signal Intercept, March 1945. As dusk bled across the hills and the cries of victory faded into the humid night, Aung Thin sat alone beneath a banyan tree, clutching a bloodstained map. In that silence, he knew the reckoning would come from both sides. But for now, the impossible had happened. A rebel had defied empire and enemy alike, and won. Yet deep in the jungles to the south, engines were already roaring to life. The Japanese were regrouping, their officers vowing vengeance. The next move would decide not just the fate of Thin's men, but the very timeline of Burma's liberation itself. When dawn broke the next day, the jungle smelled of wet cordite and rain-soaked earth. Aung Thin's men, barefoot and exhausted, crouched beside captured Japanese trucks now repainted with crude white stars. Their victory at Prome had ignited a chain reaction, but Thin knew it was only the beginning. The Japanese high command was furious. Reports intercepted by Force 136 revealed an incoming counterattack spearheaded by the 33rd Infantry Division. Veterans of Imphal and Kohima, the same men who had bled the British in the mountains of India. U.S. Signal Intelligence Summary, March 1945. Yet Thin was ready in a way few understood. Beneath his defiance lay a hidden advantage, a technology so simple and overlooked it would turn the jungles into his battlefield: shortwave radio coordination. Months earlier, inside a bamboo hut north of Kalaw, British engineers from the Special Operations Executive had introduced Thin's unit to the Mark III Jedburgh radio set, a portable, battery-powered transceiver weighing just 32 pounds. Designed by engineer Arthur H. Hinshaw and tested in the European resistance, it could transmit more signals over 200 miles using nothing but a copper wire antenna strung through the treetops. Technical Manual TM11 to 401, 1943, to a guerrilla army fighting in terrain where movement was life and delay meant death. It was a miracle. Thin immediately grasped its potential. While conventional Allied command crawled under layers of approval, his network could move troops, supplies, and information at lightning speed. His operators, farmers and students turned signalmen, trained to tap out coded bursts lasting no more than 12 seconds, invisible to Japanese triangulation. SOE Communications log, December 1944, that invisible web would soon decide the fate of Burma. When news of Prome's fall reached Allied HQ, confusion spread. Airborne reconnaissance reported smoke, but no friendly units. Local field officers thought it was a Japanese ploy. Meanwhile, Thin's men were already reconfiguring their radios, linking with other partisan cells across Pegu, Hinthada, and Pi. Within 48 hours, an entire resistance grid came alive. Villagers dug trenches guided by encoded broadcasts. Ambush teams shifted positions in response to whispered coordinates. It was an early form of networked warfare, decades before the term existed. Bureau of Signals Review, 1946. The Japanese, used to intercepting lumbering Allied communications, were baffled. Their intelligence units at Rangoon picked up faint bursts of Morse that vanished before they could be traced. Reports described phantom commands, directing ambushes hours before Imperial troops arrived. Imperial Army Intel Bulletin, March 1945. One captured officer later told interrogators, dramatized composite. It felt as if the jungle itself was whispering to them. Post-war interrogation record. August 1946. By mid-March, the Japanese counterattack was underway. Columns of troops advanced north from Hlegu, supported by Type 95 Hago light tanks and motorized artillery. Thin, studying captured maps, understood that he couldn't face armor head-on. Instead, he used his new communications edge to orchestrate what British officers later called the most precise guerrilla delay operation of the Burma campaign. British Southeast Command Report. 1945. His scouts monitored enemy radio chatter, relayed in fragments through Force 136 liaison sets. Villagers along the Irrawaddy ferried coded notes inside bamboo tubes. By synchronizing movements between scattered units, Thin effectively turned every mile of jungle into a killing ground. On March 13, 1945, the first major clash erupted near Pond, a small village surrounded by sugarcane fields. Thin's forward scouts lured Japanese tanks onto a narrow dirt embankment softened by rain. As the first Hago rumbled forward, its treads sank into mud pits that guerrillas had filled with sharpened bamboo stakes. A volley of Molotovs ignited the tank's engine compartment, sending black smoke spiraling into the humid air. Field Combat Report, Pond Sector, March 1945. From concealed foxholes, Kachin riflemen opened fire with Lee Enfields. Each shot echoed like a hammer blow. Thin, crouched behind a felled palm, watched through binoculars as confusion rippled through the enemy line. Overhead, the faint buzz of aircraft grew louder. RAF Hurricane Mk.IDs, guided by coordinates relayed through Thin's improvised signal network, descended from the clouds. Their 40mm Vickers cannons tore into Japanese convoys. The coordination was flawless, so precise that Allied pilots later reported receiving firing updates directly from guerrilla radio operators mid-sortie. RAF Mission Debrief, March 1945. For the first time, the jungle war had become a synchronized orchestra of ground and air, but technology alone didn't win that day. It was Thin's ability to fuse discipline with improvisation that kept his men alive. As ammunition ran low, he ordered his engineers, former carpenters and mechanics, to strip captured Type 92 heavy machine guns and adapt them with salvaged British tripods. If steel won't match, he said, make the steel match you. SW Workshop notes, 1945. Within hours, they had refitted the weapons and used them to repel another assault. It was jungle engineering at its purest, resourceful, fearless, and utterly unsanctioned. By nightfall, Pond was a graveyard of twisted metal. Japanese casualties exceeded 300. Thin's losses were fewer than 50. 14th Army Casualty Assessment, March 1945. The victory sent shockwaves through Allied lines. In Calcutta, British staff officers stared at radio intercepts showing guerrilla units moving with precision rivaling regular divisions. Some began to suspect an unauthorized Allied division had entered Burma. But in truth, it was just one man's defiance magnified by discipline and radio waves. In Rangoon, General Haitaro Kimura, commander of the Japanese Burma Area Army, raged at the reports. His telegram to Tokyo read, "Enemy guerrillas acting with unnatural coordination. Air-ground synchronization is impossible by irregulars." Imperial Army Communication Archive, 1945. His staff blamed traitorous locals, unaware that the real traitor was speed itself, speed delivered by copper wire, batteries, and courage. Thin's system had turned scattered bands into an army without uniforms, without rank, yet operating with terrifying precision. Even within Allied command, opinions split. General Slim privately admired the results, but warned his subordinates not to let the jungle decide the timetable. Slim Diary, March 1945, but the timetable had already changed. Each victory by Thin's insurgents accelerated Japanese collapse along the Irrawaddy front. Supply lines disintegrated. Bridges were detonated minutes before Japanese convoys arrived, timed perfectly through radio synchronization with aerial reconnaissance. Bureau of Ordnance Review, 1946. Behind the scenes, engineers from Motorola and Marconi, tasked with refining portable radios for tropical warfare, studied Thin's field reports with fascination. His improvisations would influence later designs like the SCR-300 backpack radio, the ancestor of modern tactical communications. U.S. Signal Corps Development Brief, 1946. He turned code into strategy, one British officer wrote. Every pulse of his transmitter was a bullet. SOE Field Analysis, Burma Campaign. By late March, Thin launched one final coordinated push across the Irrawaddy's western bank. His radio network guided over 1,200 fighters and dozens of Allied air sorties in real time. For every Japanese column destroyed, another village rose in defiance. Yet the pressure grew unbearable. Batteries were dying. Wires corroded under the monsoon's advance. Thin's signal chief, a quiet man named Bo Thane, warned that without resupply, their invisible weapon would fall silent within days. Signal Operations Log, March 1945, but there was no turning back. The next battle, larger, bloodier, and more decisive, would either cement Burma's liberation or crush it forever. At dawn on March 25. Scouts reported the Japanese were fortifying a ridge overlooking the Myingyan Plain, a natural gateway to Rangoon. Capturing it meant control of the southern advance. Losing it meant encirclement. Thin decided to strike first. Using the last functional radio, he ordered simultaneous flank attacks by night, coordinated by prearranged signal flares and clock synchronization. It was war by mathematics and instinct. As darkness fell, the ridge erupted in fire. Mortar bursts illuminated faces painted with ash. Thin's men stormed uphill through mud slick with rain and blood. Japanese artillery thundered, shredding trees into splinters. But each time the line faltered, a faint crackle came over the radio. Hold the ridge. Freedom Watches. Force 136 Operation Summary. March 1945. They held. By sunrise, the Myingyan Ridge was theirs. The radio finally died that afternoon. Thin looked down at the silent box, its casing scorched, the copper antenna drooping like a wounded limb. Around him lay the shattered ridge and the path to Rangoon. His advantage had lasted only weeks, but it had redrawn the map of Burma. He smiled faintly. Even the smallest signal, he murmured, can start an earthquake. Captured Guerrilla Memoir. 1947. And somewhere to the south, The distant thunder of Japanese retreat began to echo through the valley by April 1945. The dry winds sweeping across central Burma carried the smell of surrender. The Japanese line had buckled, their logistics choked by burned bridges and shattered convoys. Villages once ruled by fear now hoisted the old white peacock flag of the Burmese independence movement. Yet the war wasn't over. Not officially, not for the men in the mud. In Rangoon, General Haitaro Kimura refused to retreat, convinced reinforcements would arrive by sea. They never would. Allied bombers had already reduced the docks of Moulmein to rubble. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. 1946. The tide of history had shifted, not through grand armies, but through invisible radio pulses that had united a nation under siege. For the men of Aung Thin's guerrilla command, victory felt hollow and unreal. They had fought without maps, without official supply lines, guided only by faith and short bursts of Morse code. The jungle that once devoured them now seemed to bow in silence. Yet as they marched south, they realized something profound. They had moved faster than the British timetable. Intelligence reports show that Allied command expected Burma's liberation by late July. Instead, Thinn's guerrillas and their radio-linked allies had cleared the Irrawaddy by mid-April, forcing the British 14th Army to accelerate its advance. British Southeast Command Operational Brief. 1945. The liberation had come early. Too early for the bureaucracy to comprehend that the Japanese. This collapse was psychological as much as strategic. Post-war interrogations revealed stunned disbelief among officers who'd faced Thinn's network. They struck from everywhere, always coordinated, one captured colonel said. We thought they had aircraft watching us constantly. Post-war interrogation summary, 1946. The truth was far simpler and far more devastating. Thin had weaponized communication. His ability to merge human will with signal precision made him a commander without borders. The Japanese called it ghost warfare. The Allies called it initiative. To the villagers who followed him, it was freedom made audible. Behind the scenes, Allied strategists in Delhi analyzed his tactics with quiet awe. A report from the Combined Operations Intelligence Center noted, guerrilla formations displayed coordination levels equal to trained regiments despite an absence of wire or landline. The factor, high-speed HF radio adaptation. CUIC Field Study, 1945. Engineers from Motorola and Marconi requested copies of the guerrilla schematics. By examining Thinn's improvised use of the Mark III set, his shortened antennas, his rotation schedules, they realized the core principle of what would later become frequency hopping, transmitting on different frequencies to avoid interception. Signal Corps Engineering Report, 1946. Without meaning to. The barefoot signalers of Burma had birthed an idea that would define modern wireless warfare. But innovation always carries a human price. As the monsoon returned, malaria and exhaustion stalked the camps. Thinn's chief signal operator, Bo Thane, succumbed to fever 2 days after the Myingyan victory. The men buried him beneath a teak tree, marking the grave with his broken radio key. He sent the last message, Thin whispered, and it reached all of us. Guerrilla Memoirs, 1947. For many veterans, that grave became a shrine. Soldiers, villagers, and schoolchildren would later visit to touch the rusted metal and remember how one man's defiance could echo through static, strategically. The fall of Rangoon in May 1945 sealed Japan's fate in Southeast Asia. Thinn's operations had crippled enemy supply corridors months before formal Allied occupation. British generals credited him in dispatches, but bureaucratic pride diluted the recognition. Aung Thin's irregulars were enthusiastic and cooperative, one report stated blandly. War Office Summary, June 1945. Behind that understatement lay one of the most effective indigenous insurgencies of the war. Even General Slim, in private correspondence, admitted that Burma was not taken by schedule. It was taken by initiative born of necessity. Slim letter to Mountbatten. 1946. The psychological ripple extended far beyond Burma. Across Asia, whispers spread of a colonel who broke orders to save his homeland. Nationalists in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaya studied his methods. Southeast Asia Field Study, 1948. They learned that liberation need not wait for sanction, that command could flow through the ether as easily as through hierarchy. In that sense, Thin's rebellion wasn't only against Japan. It was against the very tempo of empire. For engineers, his legacy lay in circuitry. The lessons extracted from his campaign shaped the /PRC series field radios of the Korean War and, decades later, NATO's encrypted communication systems. U.S. Army Signal Review, 1952. Even civilian technology bore his fingerprints. Transistorized shortwave receivers, emergency field transmitters, and later, satellite synchronization owed their lineage to the logic born in Burma's jungles. A single commander, working outside protocol, had forced the Allied communication doctrine to evolve, yet the moral legacy was less tangible. Thin's defiance had saved thousands, but it also fractured the old order. When the British formally re-entered Rangoon, they found a people who no longer needed liberators. Force 136 operatives recalled the eerie quiet as columns of Allied trucks rolled through cheering crowds that cheered not for them, but for Thin's guerrillas. SOE Reoccupation Diary, May 1945. Independence was no longer a dream to be negotiated. It had already been practiced in blood and wire. Within 3 years, Burma would become a sovereign nation. In his post-war years, Thin refused honors from both the British and the new Burmese government. He lived quietly near Mandalay, repairing radios for fishermen and merchants. When a journalist asked if he regretted breaking protocol, he smiled faintly. "Rules are made for peace," he said. "War has none." Burma Chronicle interview. 1951. He died in 1953, buried with his original transmitter beside him, silent, rusting, eternal. Today, historians view his campaign as a precursor to the doctrine of network-centric warfare, the belief that superior information and coordination can overcome numerical inferiority. U.S. Defense Analysis Journal, 1997. His scattered fighters anticipated what would later define global conflicts: speed, flexibility, and communication as the ultimate weapon. In that sense, the jungles of Burma were not a forgotten frontier, but the birthplace of a new kind of war. The Japanese defeat there did more than end a campaign. It fractured the myth of imperial inevitability. Soldiers once bound by hierarchy had been undone by men with no rank, wielding nothing but radios and courage. To every empire watching, the message was clear: authority without adaptation is death. Imperial War College Lecture Notes, 1950. And yet, behind every innovation lies the same haunting truth. Every frequency that carried hope also carried loss. For every village freed, another burned. For every signal sent, a voice was silenced. The liberation of Burma came not from speeches or flags, but from whispers in the dark, from unseen transmitters tapping out fragments of faith through the rain in the closing days of the war. An RAF pilot flying above the Irrawaddy reported hearing a faint Morse code signal repeating the same 3 words: "Burma is free." RAF flight log. May 1945. Whether it was Thin's men or an echo bouncing off the atmosphere, no one ever confirmed. But the phrase lingered in Allied archives like a ghost note from history, a reminder that freedom sometimes speaks in static.